Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, What's New in Dermatology and AAD Recap. My name is Corinne Pettit, and I will be your moderator for tonight's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items that you know how to participate in today's event. So we've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. This means if you can hear music through your computer, you should be able to hear the presentation. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select Use Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to tell those of you who may be new to the foundation about who we are, our mission, and what we do. In 2014, the National Psoriasis Foundation developed a new strategic plan which drives everything we do as an organization. To achieve our mission, the following goals were identified. Number 1, accelerate discovery to cure psoriatic disease. Number 2, improve health outcomes. And number 3, achieve goals to help reach our mission, whether it's being involved with an event or becoming a volunteer. By attending today's program, you've already taken a step towards expanding your knowledge about psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis to help manage your disease and to find others who understand what it means to live with psoriatic disease. You can help accelerate efforts towards a cure and a greater understanding of psoriatic disease by participating in the NPF and Corona National Psoriasis Patient Registry, which is the largest independent observational registry of psoriasis patients in the U.S. The registry, which involves a network of dermatology clinics, collects and studies patient health information, allowing researchers to compare the safety and efficacy of psoriasis treatments, better understand conditions that are related to psoriasis, and explore the history of the disease. You can also share your experience with researchers about what it means to live with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis by participating in Citizen Scientists. Answer your questions and view data along with thousands of other patients. Data is used to help researchers gain a better understanding of this disease. We continue to improve health outcomes through our Patient Navigation Center, the world's first personalized support center for people impacted by psoriatic disease. The Foundation's Patient Navigation Center is available to help you find physicians, treatment information, navigate insurance issues, or access support through our one-to-one program and more. Contact us at 1-800-723-9166 or visit psoriasis.org/navigation center after tonight's presentation. To achieve the Foundation's goals as mentioned, please support our mission to fund research, educational programs, and support through donations or by participating in Team NPF events such as walks, runs, cycles, or bingos. To find an event of interest to you, visit www.teamnpf.org. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Richard Langley, Professor of Dermatology and Director of Research, Division of Dermatology at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and NPF Medical Board member. Welcome, Dr. Langley.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I guess good afternoon in the East Coast, and for those of you who are joining on the West Coast, good morning. Really looking forward to presenting this session, which is the first time we've done something like this. So when we had the annual board meeting at the American Academy of Dermatology, we brought up some ideas. And this was one of the ones that came up. And specifically, the idea was that there's a tremendous amount of new data that comes out at the American Academy meeting. And many times that data doesn't really filter through to patients until months and sometimes even years later by the time the papers get published. And we thought that we would try this as a pilot. The idea being we're going to show you the posters. I've selected hundreds of posters and presentations that happened, and I've selected 7 of the ones that I thought were most interesting and particularly of relevance to patients and patient care. So some of the slides are a little technical. However, I'm going to walk you through them, and I thought it's better to see them the way that they're presented at the Academy and for us to kind of go over some of the highlights. And then hopefully you give us your feedback. Tell us what you think of this format, because it is a novel way of doing this to show you cutting edge science, what's happening in psoriasis research, and where the opportunities are going to be. So in that vein, I've got 5 main themes here that I'm going to cover, and we'll just launch right into it now. So the first poster that I covered was one by Dr. April Armstrong, who's a board member for the NPF, working to help you. And she did a really interesting study which looked at the equivalency of doing follow-up care with psoriasis patients either online, so through a computer and phone, potentially, much like we're doing today, versus in office. And I think the rationale for this kind of study is it's no secret, at least in my practice, and I've worked in the US and in Canada, and patients are similar there. Many of them find it a challenge to get into the office, particularly if they have to come in every 3 or 6 months. They may have to get time off work. In some cases, they may live a fair distance from the office, negotiate traffic, get parking, and sometimes wait a long time for which sometimes can be a fairly short visit, because routine follow-up visits many times are really just a check-in to see how you're doing. You know, an annual visit where you're perhaps getting a complete skin check, looking for skin cancers, going over more advanced lab work and such. These kind of things can be done in office, but the question is, can you do this online? And so what Dr. Armstrong did was she had 296 patients that were identified, randomized to either get the in-person typical care that you would get where you go to the office versus the online platform, and assessments were done at month 3, 6, 9, and 12. Now, the table on the right-hand side that I'm highlighting here compares the patients, whether you're online or in person, looking at, average being male, 50% we have prior treatments that were on biologic users, were about 20% of the patients, and looking at the PASI. And for those of you who aren't familiar with these abbreviations, a PASI is a Psoriasis Area Severity Index. And it's the most commonly used metric that we use in clinical trials to assess severity of psoriasis. And it's exactly as the name says, it's psoriasis area. So it's looking at the area on your body, and severity. And the severity that as physicians that we judge this to be is generally the redness in the skin, how thick it is, and how scaly it is. So this is what often your doctor is doing when they're looking at you. They're making a PASI score. The BSA is the body surface area. That's just what percentage of your body. We often tell patients, if they're doing it themselves, to use your hand as being 1% of your body, and you have 100%. So if you can cover with 10 hands on your body, that would be 10%. And that's considered to be, under current definitions, as moderate to severe. And I say current because things are moving. A PGA is just a physician or a patient global assessment. This is just a global assessment saying, are you clear? Do you have very mild disease? Do you have more moderate disease? Do you have severe disease? And so these global assessments are just taking a look and saying, this is how I am. So those are the kind of metrics that we use in the office, and they're the metrics that were being used in the study. And what April showed on this graph, which is kind of complicated to look at, but a simple way of doing it is that this is the PASI equivalence, and it's measuring the equivalence between what physicians and patients said. And if it's around 0, here, we're saying that these are roughly equivalent. Body surface area, roughly equivalent. And here we have the PGA patient assessment here. So essentially, there was a very similar results seen between the routine visit and the online visit, and there were 10% dropouts from the overall, and it was a little higher in those who were on the online. So I think this is a really interesting study because it's asking a question that is of interest to doctors as well, physicians, dermatologists that have long wait lists or having trouble getting patients in. This might reduce our footprint on the environment as well by reducing the visits to the office. And teledermatology is increasing use. And I think this was a really interesting and a well-designed study. A couple questions that it didn't answer for me was, did patients like this? How did they feel when they were online versus those that were in the office? And it would be interesting to have patients doing both over time and then comparing it. And what about detection of safety issues? I mean, I think that laboratory results are one thing, but skin cancer examinations would be a separate. And how often do you need to see patients? I mean, generally, even for melanoma, it may only be every 6 months or a year to follow those patients. So, this may be reasonable, but I think these are some of the things that we need to look at. And I think that over time, this kind of approach is going to find its way increasingly into our offices. We're going to be doing more teledermatology. Computers have become and cell phones have become an appendage to many people. And I think we're going to find increasing uses of cell phones and technologies which are going to monitor. This is what Dr. Armstrong used, but we're seeing all sorts of innovations now in ways of monitoring, even new fitness monitors which can monitor heart rates and other things. And what's the future going to hold for being able to monitor psoriasis through telemedicine and through electronic technology? So interesting paper for me anyway. So I have 7 posters. The second one I thought I would choose was moving right into what's happening in therapies. And this is a fairly complicated slide. This involves showing all of the biologics that are currently existing in 2018 and emerging. And there are in the US right now 9 approved biologics: etanercept, adalimumab, infliximab. Certolizumab, I believe, is available if you have psoriatic arthritis, but for psoriasis, those would be the top 3 in the TNFs. Ustekinumab, Stelara. And then we have the top 3: IL-17, secukinumab or Cosentyx, ixekizumab or Taltz, and brodalumab was recently approved. And for interleukin-23, we have guselkumab or Tremfya was approved in the last year, and tildrakizumab or Ilumya, interesting name, was approved also within the last year. Risankizumab, mirikizumab are undergoing investigation. So, I mean, this is incredible. When you think that 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, we had methotrexate, cyclosporin, and now look at the incredible options that are available for patients, and in increasing options. We have 9 available now. Essentially, we should have 13 molecules available in the next few years, and there are others under investigation. And this is an area, I mean, many of us have been working on, I guess, since I was at Harvard when I ran the clinical trials unit. I began with this in 1997. So in 20 years, we've seen this incredible development. Okay, so the first question I thought that was really interesting was a poster that, when we talk about the excitement of biologics, I think it's really important to put it in context. And by that, I mean that many times when you first hear about the results from a clinical study, you will hear the results, but you have to ask yourself, is that appropriate to me? Will I get those same results that I'm hearing about perhaps through the National Psoriasis Foundation, or perhaps if you're watching TV or if you're reading the magazines, you might hear about response rates, which we're seeing now upwards of 80, 90% of patients getting a significant improvement. Well, this poster asked this question, and it said, what about patients that have actually failed prior therapies, specifically tumor necrosis factors? So someone who'd had Humira, for example, what happens if they failed it? What's their likelihood of doing well if they start an interleukin-17 antagonist, something like Cosentyx or Taltz? And it's a really relevant question. And what they did, and it was a really in fact, it's the only study I've ever seen that has been this well designed and this rigorous in its analysis. What they did was they said, let's look at that 75% improvement in the PASI for Cosentyx given after 16 weeks. So patients are going to get this, but we'll divide these patients into 3 groups. Group 1 are what are called primary. They did not have a good primary response. That means that you took the drug, and in the first period, you didn't do well. You failed it. You didn't hit that good response, which in this case was a 75% improvement or 50%, but the quality of life for the patients was good. And that definition is at the bottom of the slide, by the way, in case you want to come back and look at it. Group 2 were those patients that had what we call a secondary failure. And these are people who do well with the drug, with a TNF, but then they lose a response. So someone who's on Humira, for example, and after maybe 6 months or a year that no longer works for them, how are those patients different? Because each of these groups turn out to be quite potentially different responses. And group 3 are those who have failed at least one TNF. So maybe someone who failed Enbrel and Humira, or Enbrel, Humira, and Remicade, for example. So the objective was to be very rigorous in defining a population that maybe doesn't usually make it into clinical trials. And these would be very difficult patients. These would be patients that would be difficult to treat, because if you failed other drugs, the thinking is maybe you're not going to be as responsive to another therapy. And because maybe it means they've had psoriasis for 20 or 30 years, and very difficult psoriasis, maybe severe psoriasis that normally when I see patients like this, they tell me nothing's worked for me. I've tried everything. And this is the question in this group of patients: how do they respond? And the patients were typically taken who have a 10% body surface area. They had failed to respond to, so these are really severe patients. They had tried cyclosporin and methotrexate and phototherapy. They either couldn't take them or had failed them. And this, just for context, this is the results from the study that I was the first author on from the New England Journal of Medicine. It was the very first phase 3 study using Cosentyx, because that's the drug we're looking at here. And just to show you, the arrow here shows you the primary endpoint, 77%. And we can see that we got up to about 87% of patients getting response. 86% in the erasure study. These are just two different studies that were done. But if we're trying to get an idea of what we would expect to see, we're expecting to see here at week 16, upwards of 80% of patients getting a response. And you need to keep that number in your mind. It's important because we're now going to compare that to what we saw in these more difficult to treat patients. This is the more difficult to group patients results. And we see that in that group 1, which were the primary failures, 71%, group 2, secondary, around 70%. But look at group 3. These are patients who have failed multiple drugs, multiple TNFs, only 47%. That's about almost half of what we saw in our clinical studies. So why is this relevant? To me, this is incredibly relevant when I see it. So if a patient comes in and sits down and says to me, I want to go on Cosentyx, I want to go on secukinumab. I heard about this. I had a friend who took this, who was the first thing they took, and they had a 90%, they did almost cleared. And if I look at them and they say, well, what was your history like? What have you taken? If they said, well, I tried Enbrel and it didn't work for me. I tried Humira, it didn't work. I tried. And I think, well, you may not get that same response. And so this is really helpful for setting expectations, to recognize that some patients have very severe psoriasis and that they have difficult psoriasis that's recalcitrant to treat. And we have to educate them that these wonderful results we're seeing, they are very good. And here we got still half the people responding when nothing else works. So this is still a great response, but it's not maybe what they would expect to see if they were what we call a naive patient, a patient that had never received anything, for example. The second point that I think is interesting, and to me this is a speculation, but it's something that many of us are asking, is this the right approach? When you have a patient who has bad psoriasis, should we be saying to them, try methotrexate, try cyclosporin, try Enbrel, try Humira? Should we be doing this, or should we be saying, you know what, let's give this patient the best therapy for their disease right off the bat? Should we advocate to try to give patients access to the very best therapies early? And will that have an impact on their response? Will it have an impact on how well they respond initially? And will it have an impact on how they respond over time? Will those patients be easier to control? And the kind of, I guess, pie in the sky, holy grail here is, if you treat people early, is it possible to induce a remission such that their psoriasis disappears for a prolonged period? That last kind of pie in the sky is an actual research question that we're looking at right now. And we're doing this in you can go online, and if you go into clinical trials that are going on, it's currently going on internationally, Canada, US, and Europe. We're asking that question called this. It's called a step-in study, where we're trying to treat people within the first 6 months of treatment and randomizing them to early treatment with biologics to see whether we can impact their disease and induce significant change in disease course. So I really thought this paper was of relevance. I know, again, I apologize. It's complicated. We're using lots of statistical numbers here, but I've tried to explain it to you in a way that I think will hopefully make sense to most people. The third paper I chose was one that dealt with safety. And I think the number one thing that many patients come up to me before they start these drugs is a concern about safety. They're asking, well, can I take this? Will I get cancer? Will I get infection? What's the risk? Well, often the data that we have is from clinical trials, which is short-term and often a few thousand patients. So the more data we have, the better it is. And that's why the Corona registry that you heard about is so important. And I think I'm just starting working in that program. And I really think that this is the way to go forward with registries. But in the meantime, we have clinical trial data. And this is the largest sample we've seen so far for Cosentyx. 10,000 patient years of exposure, 19 studies, okay? Almost 5,000 patients, and on average, then these patients are followed for a couple of years. But we can see we've got patients out to 5 years here. And what's relevant really is the next 2 slides. This slide looks at Candida infections, MACE, which is called major adverse cardiac event, and malignancies. And what you want to look for here is being as close to zero as we can would mean essentially nothing. And particularly as these bars hit zero, we're thinking these are really low numbers. Candida infections, we know that these occur with interleukin-17 with any of the drugs. This is an issue, but actually it turns out to be a fairly mild issue. We're seeing around 2 or 3 per 100 patient years. So over at 100 patients, 3 patients, about 3% of them will get this. It tends to be fairly mild. Tends to be resolved spontaneously, or we can treat the Candida. So typical yeast infection. Women have had yeast infections for years with antibiotics, and now men are getting them as well, getting them in the mouth, or getting them, people can get them in the genital area, but small, fairly mild, and treatable. Cardiac events are very low, and these rates, in fact, the other thing is these rates aren't increasing over time, which is good, but these are low rates, and they're not higher than we would expect to see in a population of psoriatic patients who we know actually are at higher risk of myocardial infarctions. That's been the data coming out. And tumors, malignancies, not increasing over time. Numbers seem to be low, and all the data so far has been reassuring. We have not seen any data, with the exception of one registry, the SOLAR registry recently, that's shown any increased cancer. And even that SOLAR registry, when we adjusted the numbers, didn't turn out to be significant. So we're not seeing any of these solid organ tumors. We do exclude, it says up at the top, NMMC. What's that mean? Non-melanoma skin cancer. That's basal cell, squamous cell. We exclude those because these are confounding, and many of the patients who have psoriasis have had extensive sun exposure, either through ultraviolet radiation or natural sun exposure. We think there's an increased risk anyway in patients with psoriasis. They tend to get more basal cells and squamous cells, tend to be fairly mild cancers. We can remove them, but they are things we need to think about, and it's not clear the biologics really are increasing these. And the second slide in this series is something that's very important to anyone on an interleukin-17 antagonist, the Cosentyx, the Taltz, this brodalumab. And that is the history of the presence of inflammatory bowel disease. And what's really interesting is that there are essentially no cases of Crohn's, okay? There are a few cases of ulcerative colitis, but very low rates. And again, the rates that we're seeing are within the rate you would expect. So this is a very low level rate here. We know that inflammatory bowel disease is, again, one of the comorbidities that's increased in psoriasis. So we see more of it, just as we see more diabetes, we see more hypertension, we see more obesity, we see more sleep apnea, we see more heart attacks. So the question is, where you know that they're increased, are they increased with the drug? And it doesn't look like we're seeing any signal here. Now, there is a warning on the label when you're being prescribed this drug that if you have a history of active disease, you should take precaution. And many dermatologists, really, if you have a history of inflammatory bowel disease, we will choose a different drug for you because there's so many options. I have used this in people who have a history, but generally it's not my first line choice. So that was my third poster, which was safety. And I think the overall message here is reassuring. Long-term data, data that's showing improve, really consistent with our early results, very good safety profile, very good risk benefit. So even though I listen to, of course, here in Canada, I hear the US ads, and you hear this rapid description of adverse events that happen with these drugs, which is quite frightful when I think if you're listening on the TV. What the reality is that I guess that must be things that they have to do for legal reasons. But the data that I'm seeing, and I've treated over 1,000 patients with biologics, and I have over 100 with this drug in particular, really a very, very good safety profile. Everything has risks, of course, but I think the risk benefit of these drugs is excellent. All right, so ixekizumab, another interleukin-17 antagonist. I selected a poster from this. And why did I select this one? Because it was a really interesting topic. This is called the IXORA-Q. And if it's hard enough for you to remember all these 13 names I mentioned and what they do, try to remember all these study names. It's complicated. So let's not worry about what the name is and just what the topic was. And that was that this was a study, first randomized controlled trial using a biologic in genital psoriasis. Why is this important? This is super important because patients that have genital psoriasis, really the ones that I have managed, it has a profound negative impact on their quality of life. It interferes with their ability to have normal relationships with their partners. It's embarrassing for them to talk about. Many times they tell me that they're in public and they're scratching themselves and they catch themselves doing it and they're embarrassed. So, I mean, it's a horrible location to have psoriasis. And compound that with the fact it's embarrassing for most people to talk about. So they're not going to come to their physician often to talk about it. And many doctors, it turns out, if you ask dermatologists, they don't ask specifically about this area. So, it's important to have drugs that work well. The other part that's really interesting about this study is, as apart from being a very important study, is that most of our studies that you look at, and in fact, to get approved for a biologic, you generally have to have what's called the rule of tens, which is 10% body surface area, often the POSI score that we were talked about earlier, 10, and a quality of life measure, which is over 10. And it varies a little bit. Sometimes it's 12 or 15, but generally that's what the number is. That number is quite high for some people. One of the challenges right now is to look at patients that have 5% body, maybe they don't have 10%, but they can be significantly impacted, particularly if it involves genitals. What about the face? So making these arbitrary area definitions to define severity is something that the National Psoriasis Foundation has been championing and looking into and researching and trying to come up with definitions of what's the more mild to moderate population. And what is mild to moderate? I mean, how can we call something mild just because someone has 1% if it's their genitals, or if it's on their hands and they can't work, or it's on their feet and they can't walk? I mean, these area judgments are inadequate, really. It really, to me, what matters most is not what I think, it's what my patient thinks. If I have a patient that comes into me and they're telling me they're miserable and they have 5% psoriasis and they've tried every cream in the book and no one will give them anything, how can I tell them that they're not severe, that they're not moderate? To them, if it's impacting their life, if it's making their life miserable, it's important. And many times physicians don't get it. I did a study a number of years ago where I actually invented these tattoos of psoriasis, and I brought them to medical students and I got them to wear them, and half of them wouldn't wear them. They were too embarrassed to put them on their face. I said, put them on your face and go outside and walk outside and tell me, come back tomorrow and tell me what reaction you had. And the half that did do it, we published this in the American Academy of Dermatology a few years ago. And the half that did it, they were transformed. They really understood what it was like to have a skin disease like psoriasis in a visible area. They said, I was embarrassed. I even did this with my kids. I sent them to school and I said, come back and tell me what happened. And when they came back, one of my sons said, well, I was really embarrassed. I said, I went in the washroom and I washed it off. And I was like, well, that's patients with psoriasis can't wash it off. And so people who don't have a disease like this, to truly empathize, it's hard unless you really have it. And if you listen to patients, you get it. And I get it. I get that this area, even though it's only 1% in the genitals, is significant. And so this study is really important for that reason, because it looked at smaller areas and it's starting to push the envelope to treating patients, not based on arbitrary definitions that doctors or researchers or the FDA makes, but what matters to patients. And in this study, they got either ixekizumab or placebo. And look at the results. These patients had significant improvements. We're getting 73% here versus placebo. So, this is the global assessment. But what did the patients tell us? I mean, that's what's important. And this is what the patients are telling us. They're telling us their impact on sexual activity significantly improved. We're seeing significant differences here. 85% had said that did their psoriasis get worse after sexual activity? The percentage of patients that found that before versus after significantly improved. So this is a really important study. It's telling us not just that, these drugs work, they help patients have normal sexual activity. Yes, that's all important. But it's bringing up the important that genital psoriasis is not adequately addressed. It does impact a patient. It makes improved awareness. And to me, the hidden message here is its importance about this subclass of psoriasis, not just here, but 1% in the hands, 1% on the feet, on the face, and that we as physicians, and I think the NPF, is obviously advocating for patients, is trying to bring out these areas and educate all groups, physicians, public, payers, that this is an important area. And hopefully from our end as researchers, we can advocate as well by publishing results like this that show the importance of this disease to patients and how improving makes a difference in their lives. All right, so I have just 3 more posters left, and I'm sorry if I'm going through them a little slow, but because I can't see you in front of me, I want to make sure I really explain them well. And again, on your feedback, if I did a lousy job at this and I was going too slow, just tell me and I'll make sure I go faster next time. But unfortunately, if I go too fast and you don't get it, then I've lost it. So I'm going to just 3 more. So I think we'll probably do another 10 minutes or so. Emerging therapies. So the emerging therapies I mentioned earlier, I think risankizumab is one of the most exciting. Risankizumab is an interleukin-23 antagonist. And what's really interesting is that we're seeing head-to-head trials with these new drugs against drugs that have been the best drugs we've ever had in psoriasis. Ustekinumab or Stelara, shown here in yellow, is compared to risankizumab, the interleukin-23. Stelara has been a breakthrough molecule worldwide. And now the newer version of that is giselkumab, Tremfya, by the makers of ustekinumab, and has been, a remarkable drug. But interleukin-23 turns out to be a very important chemical to block in this interleukin-23 17 pathway, we say, and compared to placebo. So what do these results show? Here's another thing to notice. We talk about endpoints. Endpoints are what you have to show that your study was effective. We're talking about a 90% PASI. That's a 90% improvement with a very difficult metric. It's really important to point out what that number means, okay? That means you're almost clear. In the past, if you look back 15 years ago, there were articles that we wrote amongst ourselves as dermatologists saying, you know what, 50% improvement's good. Then it became 75%. Now we're getting 90%. Now we're getting 100%. But as primary endpoints, these are incredible. To get to this level, These drugs are working incredibly well. So if we look at the primary endpoint, how many patients are getting essentially almost clear? 75% with the new drug risankizumab. Stelara, ustekinumab, 42%, which is still a really good number. Remember, we're getting about 70% of people getting a really good response with Stelara, and we're getting about 90% of people with guselkumab, and around this also likely with risankizumab. So we're just, these results are really remarkable. These are amongst the best results we have ever seen in the treatment of psoriasis. And clear, no psoriasis at all, up to 50% of patients. I mean, really, really, really exciting news. What I think is even more exciting is two things. First, that over time, this is showing over week 52, that result actually increases over time. We're 75, 80, we're getting upwards of 85%. So more patients are getting better. And this is using a very rigorous analysis. Okay, I won't go into it, but I can tell you these are amongst the most rigorous way that you can look at this data. So it's being analyzed in a very critical way, something called a non-responder imputation. It's being looked at one of the highest endpoints you can have, a PASI 90, or I showed you PASI 100 as well. You can't get any better than perfect. And we're seeing that the majority of patients are getting to this level. The other thing that's interesting, it's kind of alluded to a little bit here, this is talking about the people that maintain a PASI 90, and when it's 100%, you can't go any higher. So you're going to have a few patients that are bopping down around probably 80 or 75. But what's interesting, I didn't show you results here, but an earlier study showed that if you stop this drug, that if you waited 6 months, that 2/3 of the patients, at least 6 months, could be longer, would still be clear. And so it's suggesting that we're having a meaningful impact on the generation of psoriasis, and it's raising a number of questions. It's saying, again, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, about the step-in study. Can we change the natural history of this disease? Can we modify? These are hypothetical questions. We don't know this yet, but it's very exciting to think that we might be not just finding great drugs, but because they're so good, by using them in certain ways, we might be able to modify the disease a bit. That's the hope. But again, it's a question. It's not known yet. You heard earlier that the objective of the National Psoriasis Foundation, one of the things is a cure. Well, a cure would be wonderful. Right now, we don't have it, but we're getting control. We're getting excellent control now. Our goal always should be to get the best we can get. So if we can get a cure, that's what we want. In the meantime, we've got the most effective drugs we've ever had to get patients clear and to keep them clear. And I think that is a wonderful milestone that shouldn't be dismissed as we move along towards our ultimate goals. And this is just an indication showing amongst the highest results we've seen. However, I can't finish off with showing you one more study that even once again is pushing the envelope. And these results are hot off the press. This is only, I guess, just 2 months ago that these results were presented. And many dermatologists may not even have seen these results. So you really are seeing the cutting edge. Bimekizumab is a new molecule. And it not only inhibits interleukin-17A, but it blocks another component of the interleukin-17 called F. Without getting into it too much, the point to mention is that it works a little differently than the other drugs. And it's being studied by a company called UCB. And this is the results. I showed you earlier around the mid-70s. Here we are getting up to 86%, getting that 90% improvement. 60%, so the highest numbers that we have ever seen, telling us again that we're continuing to learn about the psoriasis genesis, how it occurs, the fact that we're blocking this new area, IL-17F, and we get this improvement. Just to pull it back, these are early results. They're not the same as the phase 3 results I showed you. They are, they're not done head to head, so we have to wait for additional results. But I mean, I think as a patient, I think as a researcher, as a clinician, I think any of these results are exciting. They're encouraging, although they are preliminary. Okay, the last poster I'm going to present for you involves cardiovascular risk. And I think that there's been, I know from the National Psoriasis Foundation, they've done a tremendous job at communicating that we do see an increased cardiovascular risk in psoriasis patients. And there's also been very recent data showing that, by Joel Gelfand's group, showing that if you have more severe psoriasis, as your psoriasis goes from 1% to 5%, about 2 to 10% to over 10%, and even as you're going to 20 and 30 and 40% and beyond, that your risk of diabetes, for example, is increased. He has a paper that came out just last month, a really interesting paper I was talking to him about. I think it's really interesting to show that. Risk of mortality may be increased. That was presented last year at the American Academy, that severity of inflammation can be linked to cardiovascular disease. So the question becomes, in addition to controlling your cholesterol and your high blood pressure and the risk factors for cardiac disease, could drugs which impact inflammation in the body reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease? In other words, if you were to take something like a TNF antagonist, like Humira, would you get a reduced rate of heart attacks? And there's been, I think there's been over 200 papers a year being published on this area about comorbidities. And there have been a number of studies that have suggested the answer is yes. But these are not the definitive answer, because we would really need a long-term study to show it. So in the meantime, what can we do to answer this question? Well, that's what this poster did by Joel Gelfand, and it was the late-breaking research. And what he did was he had a small number of patients, 22 patients getting Stelara and 21 getting placebo. And he did a special test called an FDG PET scan. I'll show you that in the next slide. But his idea was to say, could you follow these patients? And because we can't know the final answer yet, whether you're going to reduce the rate of heart attacks or myocardial infarctions, is there a way that we could study the heart to see a reduction in the inflammation in the heart? And he did this in the aorta, what's called aortic vascular inflammation. And this is a slide from Nihal Mehta, who's a cardiologist who's from the NIH, who loaned me this slide, who also is a member of the National Psoriasis Foundation. And Nihal has been, a leader in studying inflammation in psoriasis and linking it to cardiovascular events. And as a cardiologist, we're very fortunate to have him have this interest in our patients. But this is a normal patient, and the dark black areas you see is uptake with this PET scan, FDG PET scan, and that's in the bladder. You see it similarly in psoriasis patients. But what you also see in psoriasis patients here is uptake in the arteries here, and uptake in the coronary arteries. And so the point is that there's inflammation not just in the skin and the joints, of course, but there's inflammation in the arteries. And so by doing this FDG PET scan, you can compare the response to placebo versus a drug like Stelara and to see what happens. And this slide just shows you the patients at baseline. This is the body mass index. Over 30 is obese. So these are patients which have significant obesity. And area involved, 25%. Okay, so very significant disease. And this is the results. So a mean percentage change from baseline and at the primary endpoint at the time they were studying, 18%, and it was significant versus placebo. Here we have 12 versus minus 18. The p-value means it's statistically significant. This level is highly significant. So without getting into details too much, if I can summarize for you, this was an attempt to look at the inflammation in the heart using an FDG PET scan, comparing no treatment versus being on a biologic, and showing that you could reduce inflammation in the heart, and knowing that in the aorta, and knowing that could be a proxy for myocardial infarctions. This has shown us for the first time, actually, that this is the case using this method in psoriasis patients. So again, a lot of firsts here, a lot of novel work, but very interesting. And of course, if you have psoriasis and you are, your weight is not where you want it to be. You're a smoker. You have high cholesterol. You have a family history of heart disease. If these things are there, of course you're going to try to modify those things. We're all going to try to lose weight. I'm still trying to lose my weight from the December holidays. We're going to try to avoid smoke. We're going to try to do all these healthy activities. But wouldn't it be interesting to know that in addition to this, if this kind of data would hold out, it would really change the way, again, that we look at the severity of psoriasis. If we know that psoriasis has inflammation throughout the body, and we know that our treatments are going to reduce this, then this would be another thing, another reason for us to be interested in making sure we're controlling inflammation in the body, aside from all the other reasons why we're interested. So I think that's it. That was about 40 minutes. Lots of cutting edge research. I'll stop there, but again, I'll stay here online, and if there are any questions or feel free to ask. Hi, Corinne. I can't hear you if you're there.
Sorry about that. Yes, we did have a few studies that came through, or a few questions that came through. First question here is there a way for me to access these studies so I can look at the information in more detail?
You can access the study's design on clinicaltrials.gov. All of these should be listed there. Unfortunately, this is cutting edge data, so it really is from the Academy. I've summarized it for you. The actual abstracts themselves, if you were at the Academy, or if you know someone was at the Academy, the full abstract for what I presented should be available, because I believe they were downloadable on you could download them or see them online even through the American Academy. So I don't know if you weren't a physician. I'm not sure how you get. I'm not sure if you're able to get access. I believe anyone that was at the Congress could get the abstracts, but otherwise, yeah, the data is so new, it's not published, and that's why we thought we'd do this year, to give you the information probably a year or two before it hits the normal venues that you get it from.
Great, thank you. Next question here. During blood work, what are the markers dermatologists consider to assess inflammation?
Right. So typically, the screening that we do, of course, doesn't measure inflammation. We're doing things, cholesterol, you're doing a lipids profile, CBC, the blood counts, we're doing the liver tests. Some physicians will do a C-reactive protein, and there's a certain variant of it called a highly sensitive C-reactive protein. Some physicians, that's what we're using more now. Other physicians in the past have used an ESR, erythrocyte sedimentation rate. But that's it. There's really not good biomarkers to study. That's part of the research, is can we find blood tests that we could do that could measure this? And there is research going on with that. But right now, blood work wise, those would be the two main ones. Many people are also going to be measuring, the fasting blood glucose, perhaps a test called the glycosylated hemoglobin, if you're at risk for diabetes. But those would be the main ones.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Next question. Is there any research into products that are topical rather than just biologics?
There is, for sure. There has been the most recently published and presented work involves small molecules called tofacitinib, was the most recent one that we saw. A lot of topical work going on in atopic dermatitis too, so whether or not some of those will make their way into dermatology, into psoriasis as well, but certainly most of these new products are non-steroidal agents, and so there is research. You have to get a full list of them. Again, you go on that clinical trial website, which is a public website, and you can find the full list of them there. But definitely is.
Great. Next question here. Do you have results also for female patients about heart inflammation?
Yes, so that those results, they're basically similar. So those results were had male and female in it. They didn't necessarily break out the female specifically, but often they present the results where they say the percentage of male versus female. Many of the biologic studies have had 60 or 65% are males versus females, but those results are similar in women and men so far. We haven't seen any specific differences between them, but so most of those studies, if you look at them, there's been two other ones that were done with the FDG PET studies that had women in them as well that were reported. One by Robert Bissonnette, and the other was by Joel Gelfand, actually looking at adalimumab in that population.
Great. We have multiple questions about treatment for the genital area. Could you review those again, please?
Sure. So our typical approach in the genital area has been topical, and the mainstay of therapy that dermatologists have used in the past have been topical corticosteroids. The problem with long-term topical corticosteroids in this area is that you can get local side effects, thinning of the skin. You can also get sometimes what we call blood vessel formation that can occur there, and the skin that's sometimes doesn't tolerate the use of those agents there. There's also been attempts to use non-steroidal therapies. Pimecrolimus or pimecrolimus or Elidel and Protopic tacrolimus have both been used in the genital area. And so those would be used to treat inflammation. If you have a superinfection with candidiasis, often we're adding a topical or sometimes a combination product in that area where we might use hydrocortisone with clotrimazole, for example. There are certain treatments we don't tend to use in the genitals. So we don't tend to use like the vitamin D. Sometimes those can cause burning. Of course, we can always try other non-steroidals, but I've had difficulty using them in that area. Many patients find the skin quite sensitive. So I've really been looking mostly at topical therapy. Things that we typically use in other areas of psoriasis, phototherapy, are generally restricted in the genital area because of the sensitive skin. And many times those areas are covered when you're getting phototherapy. And then so once you've moved beyond topical therapy, for people who have severe disease, it's rare for us to use systemic therapy, methotrexate, cyclosporin, or a biologic. And that's why this study was so original and important, because now this is being considered as something we would consider people who, they may have psoriasis elsewhere and the genitals, but in some cases they have mostly genital disease, and this is now entering into the consideration. It's something that hopefully we'll be able to get approval for. That's always the challenge from research, whether or not you can actually get approval for these drugs from payers.
Great. We have one final question here, time for one question here. With all of the new drugs coming out, is research really focused on finding a cure or just developing more unaffordable but effective treatments? When do you expect there will be a cure, if at all?
Well, that's a great question. And I think our research is following from, there's basically, we always say from bench to clinic and clinic back to bench. And the evolution and what's happened in psoriasis research has come about because of evolutions in our understanding of the disease. The idea of using an interleukin-23 or an interleukin-17, like, where did that come from? It came from careful study over decades amongst basic scientists and clinicians doing clinical trials and working together, doing biopsy studies and trying to sort out the mechanics of how psoriasis occurs. So really our goal, of course, would always be to cure the disease, but that will have to come as we have an understanding of the root cause of it and also whether it's a combination of genetics and immunology, the environmental. We really are still advancing our understanding of the disease. The reason why we're focusing on these treatments is because this is what we know is driving the disease right now. Those treatments don't look like they're cures. In other words, when you stop the drug, most patients will get the disease back. But what we're trying to do now, and I mentioned with the step-in study, is to step in early, is to go after this disease, maybe when patients first develop psoriasis, and hoping that might, by normalizing the abnormal immune system that's occurring in psoriasis, could doing that earlier make an impact instead of waiting till someone's had it 30 years and had multiple treatments when the kind of, as I say, the train has left the station. We need to get at the question is getting at this earlier will make a difference, and that's a question. So we don't know whether that will have an impact on the durability of disease. And when we talk about remission, and if you look at oncology, cancer, when they talk about a remission, they don't often say cure, but that's what we're thinking that's what we want to get towards. As you induce remission, as you make the psoriasis disappear, and you look at your body and you can't see any, and you haven't seen any for a year and 2 years and 3 years, is that the beginning of us understanding moving towards that goal that the NPF has stated? So I think the answer is yes, we're trying to find a cure. That would be the ultimate goal. But the first thing is to get more patients completely controlled, and then to understand how that would work. And meanwhile, in the lab, continuing to develop breakthroughs. And in terms of when, it is a funny thing in research. You never know when you're going to come across the next great discovery. You just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and trying to find the key reason for why things are occurring. And the innovation of these new drugs came about in that process. Stelara was being investigated because it worked on interleukin 12. And in the course of it, interleukin 23 was discovered, and it found out that that's actually was the target. And Stelara was working at that, and that's why the 23s were developed, because they found, well, 23 is a more targeted. We're right down to the pathway now. We know the final steps of psoriasis. We know that 23 seems to regulate the process, that 17 is right at the cell. And blocking 17, I mean, if you can see 17 in the cells of psoriasis at the skin, and we see people go on an interleukin 17, they'll often tell us that they notice their psoriasis improving within days. That I've had patients tell me they get up out of bed and their scales are on the bed, that they're leaving. So we're getting there, but in terms of when, I am not good at predicting the future. I can only tell you that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of researchers in the U.S. Who are actively working towards better treatments, and part of that would obviously be a cure.
Great, thank you so much. And if you have any other questions, please contact our Patient Navigation Center by phone, email, live chat, or Skype. And once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we'd appreciate it if you complete that and provide your feedback. Finally, I just wanted to mention that a recording of today's webcast will be available shortly on our website, and you can access our complete webcast archive by visiting psoriasis.org/webcast. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.